From Pacifica, this is Democracy Now!
My fellow Americans, a short time ago, I ordered the United States Armed Forces to launch precision strikes on targets associated with the chemical weapons capabilities of Syrian dictator Bashar al-Assad.
President Trump declares mission accomplished as the Pentagon says U.S.-led airstrikes hit sites linked to Syria's alleged chemical weapons facilities. Meanwhile, the Trump administration plans to impose new sanctions against Russia to punish it for enabling the Syrian government's alleged use of chemical weapons. Protests against the bombing took place across the United States.
Trump wanted to change the subject. He certainly wants to change the subject. Do I think that's the main reason driving the U.S. policy? No, I think there's a longer-term policy of trying to dominate this whole region.
We'll get response from Rama Kadaimi, who is member of the Syrian Solidarity Collective and the National Committee of the War Resisters League, and also from Chelsea Manning, perhaps the most famous whistleblower of the Iraq War. Then protests erupt in New York after police officers responding to a 911 call shoot dead an unarmed, mentally troubled African-American man on a street corner in Brooklyn earlier this month.
Will you guys kill us all? You guys kill us. A young man in his own community shut down. Yet again. Yet again.
Police say Saheed Vassal was holding a metal pipe that they mistook for a gun. None of the officers who opened fire were wearing body cameras. The Vassal family is now calling for the release of all unedited video from the area leading up to and during the shooting. We'll speak with Saheed's parents, Lorna and Eric Vassal. All that and more coming up. Welcome to Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. The United States is expected to introduce new sanctions against Russian companies with links to Syrian leader Bashar al-Assad following the coordinated U.S., British, and French military strikes against two chemical weapons storage facilities and a research center in Syria on Friday night. Trump hailed the military strikes a success in a tweet Saturday morning, writing, quote, "A perfectly executed strike last night. Thank you to France and the United Kingdom for their wisdom and the power of their fine military. Could not have had a better result. Mission accomplished," unquote. The military strikes against the alleged chemical weapons facilities came in response to the alleged chemical weapons attack in Duma over a week ago. The attack has not yet been independently investigated. The U.S. has blamed the Assad government for the alleged attack. On Sunday, United Nations chemical weapons investigators began examining the scene of the alleged attack, which came amidst a brutal campaign by the Syrian government to retake the rebel-held district of eastern Ghouta outside the capital, Damascus. A pro-Assad official told the New York Times the bases had been evacuated well before the coordinated military strikes, thanks to an advance warning from Russia. Multiple experts say the strikes were carefully coordinated to avoid escalating the United States' role in the ongoing Syrian conflict. This is U.S. Ambassador to the United Nations, Nikki Haley, speaking on Saturday at the UN.
Last night, we obliterated the major research facility that it used to assemble weapons of mass murder. I spoke to the president this morning, and he said if the Syrian regime uses this poisonous gas again, the United States is locked and loaded. When our president draws a red line, our president enforces the red line.
Over the weekend, crowds gathered in cities across the U.S. and the world to protest against the U.S., British, and French military strikes. Meanwhile, French President Emmanuel Macron said he convinced President Trump not to withdraw U.S. troops from Syria, reversing Trump's pledge earlier this month that he would withdraw thousands of troops stationed there. Following the U.S. military strikes against Syria, the U.S. ambassador to the UN, Nikki Haley, tried to defend President Trump's efforts to ban Syrian refugees from entering the United States. This is Ambassador Haley speaking on Fox News Sunday.
Not one of the many that I talked to ever said we want to go to America. They want to stay as close to Syria as they can.
The United States has accepted only 11 Syrian refugees so far this year. The United Nations says about 5 million Syrians have been forcibly displaced outside Syria by the ongoing 7-year conflict. We'll have more on Syria after headlines. In a highly anticipated interview that broadcast Sunday night, former FBI Director James Comey told ABC News' George Stephanopoulos he thinks President Trump's effort to pressure Comey to drop the investigation into former National Security Advisor Michael Flynn may have constituted obstruction of justice.
He says, I hope you can let it go. What do you say?
He had said, he's a good guy. I hope you can let it go. I just said, I agree he's a good guy. And there was a brief pause, and then the meeting was over.
Should you have said, Mr. President, I can't discuss this with you. You're doing something improper.
Maybe. Although, if he didn't know he was doing something improper, why did he kick out the Attorney General and the Vice President of the United States and the leaders of the intelligence community? I mean, why am I alone if he doesn't know the nature of the request? But it's possible that in the moment I should, another person would have said, sir, you can't ask me that. That's a criminal investigation. That could be obstruction of justice.
Was President Trump obstructing justice?
Possibly. I mean, it's certainly some evidence of obstruction of justice.
During the interview with Comey, which comes ahead of his release of his new book this week, the former FBI director also said President Trump is morally unfit to be president.
And I don't think he's medically unfit to be president. I think he's morally unfit to be president. A person who sees moral equivalence in Charlottesville, who talks about and treats women like they're pieces of meat, who lies constantly about matters big and small and insists the American people believe it, that person's not be president of the United States on moral grounds.
The deputy finance chair of the Republican National Committee, Elliot Broidy, has resigned over revelations he paid $1.6 million to a former Playboy model to keep quiet about their affair, which resulted in her having an abortion. Broidy is a venture capitalist who's been a longtime fundraiser for the Republican Party, which has pushed a slew of anti-choice laws nationwide. The hush money deal was brokered by Michael Cohen, President Trump's longtime personal lawyer. Cohen has separately admitted to paying $130,000 to adult film star Stephanie Clifford, also known as Stormy Daniels, to keep her quiet about her affair with Donald Trump before he became president. Cohen's home, office, and hotel room were all raided by the FBI a week ago. He's now filed a restraining order to try to prevent prosecutors from reviewing the documents seized in those raids. New details have also surfaced showing Cohen was under digital surveillance for months. Meanwhile, McClatchy is reporting special counsel Robert Mueller has evidence Cohen visited Prague during the summer of 2016, casting doubt on Cohen's claims that he did not visit Prague at this time. An intelligence dossier prepared by former British spy Christopher Steele first described Cohen's trip to Prague and says he met with a prominent Russian during the visit. In Afghanistan, a string of attacks over the weekend against government outposts killed at least 26 government security officers. The government blamed the Taliban for the attacks. Separately, at least 2 schools were set ablaze, including a girls' high school in Logar province near the capital, Kabul. In India, thousands of people took to the streets of cities across the country to demand justice after an 8-year-old Muslim girl was gang-raped and murdered in the northern Indian state of Jammu and Kashmir. One of the 3 suspected rapists is a police officer. Authorities say the motivation for the kidnapping, rape, and murder of the girl, named Asifa Bano, was to drive her Muslim family out of their village. Over the weekend, 2 lawmakers with the ruling BJP party were forced to resign after they helped organize rallies in support of the accused rapists, sparking widespread outcry. Palestinians gathered at the Israeli-Gaza border for a third Friday in a row as part of the ongoing Great March of Return protests. Paramedics say at least 30 Palestinians were injured by Israeli soldiers during Friday's protest. Israeli soldiers have killed at least 34 Palestinians since the wave of protests against Israel's occupation began on March 30th. Ecuador's president, Lenin Moreno, said on Friday 2 journalists and their driver were kidnapped and murdered along the border with Colombia. The reporter, Javier Ortega, the photographer, Paul Rivas, and their driver, Efrain Segarra, were working for the daily newspaper El Comercio at the time of their kidnapping, March 26. Ecuador is blaming a Colombian rebel group called Oliver Sinisterra Front for the murders. In El Salvador, authorities say journalist Carla Lizeth Tercios has been murdered. She worked for the magazine El Economista, The Economist. Authorities say her father received a note with a death threat against her shortly before she was kidnapped from her home. Her body was later found along the side of the highway. In Barcelona, Spain, hundreds of thousands of demonstrators poured into the streets Sunday to demand freedom for Catalan political prisoners, among them 9 Catalan leaders who are facing trial on charges of rebellion after they helped organize a referendum on Catalonia's independence from Spain last October. Back in the United States, protesters occupied a Philadelphia Starbucks Sunday to denounce Starbucks for racial profiling after a video went viral of police arresting 2 African-American men for being inside the coffee shop. Their lawyer says the 2 men were waiting for a third person to arrive for a business meeting when a Starbucks employee called the police and claimed the men were trespassing. Starbucks CEO Kevin Johnson has apologized, calling the incident reprehensible. More protests are planned at the Starbucks this morning. In Denver, Colorado, hundreds of teachers are expected to rally at the state capitol today as the wave of teacher protests continue to spread nationwide. Meanwhile, the Oklahoma Education Association says it's ended its 9-day strike over funding for education, and teachers in Kentucky also swarmed the state capitol Friday to protest cuts to education there. Kentucky Governor Matt Bevin has been forced to apologize after he tried to attack the teachers' protests by saying, quote, "I guarantee you somewhere in Kentucky today a child was sexually assaulted that was left at home because there was nobody there to watch them." In South Carolina, authorities say at least 7 prisoners are dead and 17 more have been wounded after a riot at the Lee Correctional Institution in Bishopville. It's the latest of a series of riots in recent years at the maximum security prison in South Carolina. In Alabama, an African-American teenager named Lakeith Smith has been sentenced to 30 years in prison for the murder of 16-year-old Adante Washington, even though it was a police officer who shot and killed the teenager in 2015. Lakeith Smith was tried and convicted under Alabama's accomplice law, which allows authorities to prosecute people for murder if a death occurs in the midst of a felony. He and Adante Washington were, along with other teens, allegedly carrying out a burglary when a police officer opened fire and killed Washington. A grand jury has cleared the police officer who actually killed the teenager of any responsibility. In New York City, a prominent gay rights lawyer named David Buckle died after setting himself on fire as a protest against climate change. And a handwritten suicide note found next to his body in Prospect Park, Brooklyn. He explained he doused himself in fossil fuels before lighting himself ablaze as a metaphor for the destruction of the planet. He also emailed news outlets a statement that included, quote, "Most humans on the planet now breathe air made unhealthy by fossil fuels, and many die early deaths as a result. My early death by fossil fuel reflects what we are doing to ourselves," unquote. And in South Africa, tens of thousands of people gathered in Soweto Township Saturday for anti-apartheid hero Winnie Madikizela Mandela. Winnie Mandela was known widely by South Africans as the mother of the nation. Under apartheid, Winnie Mandela was jailed repeatedly by the white minority government and survived torture and nearly 500 days in solitary confinement. In 1958, she wed Nelson Mandela. The pair remained married for 38 years, even as it appeared Nelson Mandela would never be released from prison following his arrest in 1963. This is one of the mourners, Puleng Makanya, speaking at Winnie Mandela's funeral.
We are gathered here in unity as South Africans to pay our last respects to our mother. We owe her so much because she fought for us as Black people in South Africa. Today we are thankful that all political parties have gathered here to bid her farewell.
And those are some of the headlines. This is Democracy Now!, DemocracyNow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. The United States is expected to introduce new sanctions against Russian companies with links to Syrian leader Bashar al-Assad, following the coordinated U.S., British, and French military strikes against two alleged chemical weapons storage facilities and a research center in Syria on Friday night. Trump hailed the military strikes a success in a tweet Saturday morning, writing, quote, "A perfectly executed strike last night. Thank you to France and the United Kingdom for their wisdom and the power of their fine military. Could not have had a better result. Mission accomplished," Trump tweeted. The military strikes came in response to an alleged chemical weapons attack in Duma over a week ago. The attack has not yet been independently investigated. On Sunday, United Nations chemical weapons investigators began examining the scene of the alleged attack, which came amidst a brutal campaign by the Syrian government to retake the rebel-held district of eastern Ghouta outside the capital, Damascus. A pro-Assad official told the New York Times the bases had been evacuated well before the coordinated military strikes, thanks to an advance warning from Russia. Multiple experts say the strikes were carefully coordinated to avoid escalating the U.S. role in the ongoing conflict. This is U.S. Ambassador to the UN, Nikki Haley, speaking Saturday at the United Nations.
Last night, we obliterated the major research facility that it used to assemble weapons of mass murder. I spoke to the president this morning, and he said if the Syrian regime uses this poisonous gas again, the United States is locked and loaded. When our president draws a red line, our president enforces the red line.
Over the weekend, crowds gathered in cities across the United States and the world to protest the U.S., British, and French military strikes.
Trump want to change the subject. He certainly wants to change the subject. Do I think that's the main reason driving the U.S. policy? No, I think there's a longer-term policy of trying to dominate this whole region.
Meanwhile, French President Emmanuel Macron said he convinced President Trump not to withdraw U.S. troops from Syria, reversing Trump's pledge earlier this month that he would withdraw thousands of troops stationed there.
10 days ago, President Trump was saying, the United States should withdraw from Syria. We convinced him. We convinced him that it was necessary to stay there in Syria. And I think that on a diplomatic level, beyond what happened, those three strikes, which are one element, and for me, that's not the most important thing which is happening in Syria, we convinced him that we needed to stay for the long term. We also persuaded him that we needed to limit the strikes to chemical weapons sites, after things got a little carried away over tweets, as you know.
For more, we go to Washington, D.C., where we're joined by Rama Kudemi. She is Syrian-American activist, a member of the Syrian Solidarity Collective, and on the National Committee of the War Resisters League. Here in New York, we're joined by Chelsea Manning, a network security specialist and advocate for government transparency, a queer gender rights activist, also perhaps best known as an Army whistleblower who spent 7 years in a military prison after leaking a trove of documents about the Iraq and Afghan wars and State Department to WikiLeaks in 2010. She's currently running for U.S. Senate in her home state of Maryland. We welcome you both to Democracy Now!, but Rama, let's begin with you. First, respond to the attack that took place this weekend on Syria, U.S., France, and Britain.
Thank you, Amy, for having me on. I think my first reaction when I heard these strikes were happening was, well, what's new? There's been airstrikes against Syria by the Assad regime, by the United States, by Russia, by a whole slew of actors for years now, since 2012, since the people rose up against the brutal regime of Assad and demanding their freedom and dignity. And so it was kind of infuriating to see this being presented as breaking news, this being presented as an apocalypse, that we're about to embark on World War III, especially as has been made clear again and again by the U.S. actions and words is that this was something very limited, just to kind of send a message to Bashar al-Assad that you can go on and kill people with barrel bombs, with anything, but don't limit your use of chemical weapons.
I want to turn to U.S. Ambassador to the United Nations, Nikki Haley. In an interview with Fox News on Sunday, she outlined President Trump's objectives in Syria and said U.S. troops would remain until these objectives are met.
He had three major goals that he wanted to accomplish. He, one, wanted to make sure that chemical weapons were not used, or weapons of mass destruction were not used in any way that could harm American national interest. He wanted to make sure that we defeated ISIS completely and wholly, to make sure that all of that threat was gone, because it is a threat to American national interest. And he wanted to make sure that we had good grounds to watch what Iran was doing, and they weren't making a lot of aggressive headway in terms of that, because Iran is a national threat to American interests. And so I think that, no, he never thought he'd get out in 48 hours. Yes, it is all of our goal to see American troops come home, but we're not going to leave until we know we have accomplished those things.
So, Rama Kudemi, if you can respond to all of that. Again, President Trump having recently said he was pulling U.S. troops out of Syria.
Yeah, and this has been U.S. policy. What Nikki Haley just outlined has really mostly been U.S. policy since under Obama. Nothing much has changed under Trump in terms of the United States has proclaimed that, oh, it wants to see and support the Syrian people's revolution, that it wants to see freedom and democracy in Syria, but in fact has really intervened in ways that have strengthened the regime. So its primary goal, the defeat of ISIS, i.e. the war on terror, is really what's brought the U.S. into Syria very forcefully. When they started bombing Syria in September 2014, it was against ISIS, and that's been the limit. That's really been where they focus most their energy. Once in a while, as Trump did last year, as in Trump did this year, they'll bomb a regime target, really an empty airfield, an empty chemical weapons factory, and then say, see, we want Assad gone. And yet again and again, their actions have proven that, in fact, they want regime preservation. This is not something, they are not really concerned with the Syrian people's demands for the fall of regime. They're concerned with continuing the war on terror, which has been the operation of the United States since 2001, and ensuring that we are constantly bombing quote-unquote terrorists, when in reality what the United States is doing, alongside with Russia, alongside with the regime, alongside with Iran in Syria, is the fact that everyone claims that they are fighting terrorists, and what gets lost are Syrian people's lives and dreams to live in a free and democratic Syria.
And the number of troops who are already on the ground and the U.S. intervention even until this point of the bombing?
So there are about 2,000 U.S. troops. They are mostly in Kurdish-held areas in the northeast part of the country, and they've been there to train really the Syrian Democratic Forces, which are again mostly Kurdish groups fighting against ISIS. And the U.S. has been very clear to various rebel groups that it may have sent some arms to or some night goggles to in the past, that your primary responsibility is to fight ISIS. We are not concerned with the regime. It is to fight ISIS. And so again, this kind of the story that we tell ourselves a lot of times in left circles and anti-war circles, you were talking about how, you know, this weekend people took to the streets to protest U.S. airstrikes. Where have these protesters been? Since 2012, like I've said, there has been a war going on in Syria. There have been airstrikes going on around in Syria. Since 2014, the United States itself has led a lot of these airstrikes against ISIS forces. But because we have accepted a lot of times that the war on terror is actually a good war, but as long as it's not regime change war, sadly, that's what we see. We see people who will stay who will go up in arms when the regime might be targeted, and then go completely silent when schools and mosques and community centers, Syrian community centers, are all attacked by various forces in the name of fighting terrorism.
Rama Kudemi, we are going to break and come back to this discussion. Also, what evidence there is of the sites on the ground that have been attacked? What evidence so far is there that the Syrian government was responsible for the alleged chemical weapons attack? And other issues will also be joined by Chelsea Manning, one of the, well, I guess you could say the most famous whistleblower of the Iraq and Afghanistan wars. She's running currently for U.S. Senate from Maryland. Stay with us.
Little boy doesn't cry. There are no tears to dry, and nobody left to call his name. Little hands took the place of a mother's embrace. The shadow of her fear remains. In the rubble we gather and meet in the end, and we swear it won't happen again. Yet here we are, at least we cry.
Aleppo by Sini Egg, here on Democracy Now!, DemocracyNow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. As we get the latest on what happened this weekend with the U.S., French, British bombing of Syria. In his tweet on Saturday morning, President Donald Trump wrote, "A perfectly executed strike last night. Thank you to France and the United Kingdom for their wisdom and the power of their fine military. Could not have had a better result. Mission accomplished." And this is President Trump on Friday night.
My fellow Americans, a short time ago, I ordered the United States Armed Forces to launch precision strikes on targets associated with the chemical weapons capabilities of Syrian dictator Bashar al-Assad. A combined operation with the armed forces of France and the United Kingdom is now underway.
We continue our look at Syria with Rama Kudemi, Syrian-American activist based in Washington, D.C. with the Syrian Solidarity Collective. She's on the National Committee of the War Resisters League here in New York City. Chelsea Manning is a network security specialist and advocate for government transparency, a queer gender rights activist. She's perhaps best known as, well, the most famous whistleblower of the Iraq-Afghanistan war. Served in the army in Iraq, spent 7 years in military prison after leaking a trove of documents about the Iraq and Afghan wars in the State Department to WikiLeaks in 2010, currently running for U.S. Senate in her home state of Maryland. So, Chelsea Manning, what was your response when you heard President Trump's announcement Friday night and then him tweeting mission accomplished?
Well, mission accomplished. I believe I've heard those words before.
Well, why don't we go back to those words right now? Let's go back to 2003. At the time, it was President George W. Bush.
My fellow Americans, major combat operations in Iraq have ended. In the Battle of Iraq, the United States and our allies have prevailed.
That was May 1st, 2003. Where were you at the time, Chelsea Manning?
I was in high school.
But you then would go on to Iraq.
Yes, I did.
So talk about why that matters to you, this echo of what you heard before.
Well, we've intervened in the Middle East for quite some time now. You know, going back for the United States, half a century at this point. We've been involved in Iraq, Afghanistan. Now we're involved. We're more embroiled in Syria, and so this is just a continuation. These recent events are just a continuation of years of really a projection of power into the region, and we're just consistent. We're constantly intervening as a and for what reason? It always comes down to some excuse.
Well, interestingly, one of those who responded was Ari Fleischer, who served as a White House press secretary for President George W. Bush from 2001 to 2003. Fleischer wrote, quote, I would have recommended ending this tweet with not those two words. Yeah, and he said the
Exactly.
So, Rama Kademi, your information about both the alleged attack, what we know about it at this point, and the sites that were hit. And then I want to put that same question to Chelsea.
Yeah, so I think it's interesting that we tend to continue to go back to Iraq in 2003 and the horrible decision, obviously, to invade and occupy Iraq. Horrible because it destroyed, an entire country and created, destroyed millions of lives. And I think we continue to go back on that. We pretend that the Arab uprisings that happened in late 2010, 2011 didn't happen. And we need to really, we need to look at and analyze Syria and the rest of the region in light of those uprisings, not to take away the horrible history of the United States of intervening. Obviously, the United States is concerned with its national interests, just like Russia is concerned with its national interests, just like Saudi Arabia is concerned with national interests, Iran, Turkey, et cetera, et cetera. All of these players that are now in Syria have their national interests at play, not the hopes and dreams of the Syrian people to live without a dictator, to live in freedom and dignity. And so I think it's very important that we see places like Iraq and not just assume Syria is Iraq, is Libya, which is a very racist notion, and just assumes all of these places that have Muslims and Arabs and full of brown people are the same. We can take lessons learned, but let's take the right lessons learned, not just, U.S. intervention is bad, and just stay with that shallow analysis. In terms of what's happening in Syria with the use of chemical weapons attacks, there have been numerous investigations in the past few years about chemical weapons attacks. People who are claiming and crying that, the reason that we are against this, U.S. What the U.S. just did over the weekend, we need to wait and see the investigations. Investigations have happened in the past, and they've ignored them. So last year, for example, when the attack happened in April of 2017 in Khan Sheikhoun, and its response, Trump bombed that empty airfield. 6 months after the chemical weapons attack, the Organization for the Prohibition of Chemical Weapons came out with a report and investigation. Yes, in fact, the regime was responsible for that attack. No one went back and corrected themselves and said, see, actually we were wrong by claiming that the regime didn't do it. It just didn't happen because there's this lag time between when a chemical weapon attack happens and when the investigation is actually concluded. And because we live in, unfortunately, a media world that, whether it's mainstream media or even alternative left media that only pays attention to, a few days and then forgets about the conflict in Syria, we don't see this constant thing of actually chemical weapons attacks have happened again and again, and various international bodies, whether it's the UN, the OPCW, human rights groups, have found the regime guilty again and again. So there is a pattern of behavior on behalf of the regime, and should not be shocking then that this latest attack in Douma that happened about a week or so ago would also be responsible for the regime. And I've heard reports, for example, that this morning that Russia and the regime were blocking access to for OPCW investigators to the site in Douma, which is again something that happens. The regime blocks access to investigators, human rights investigators, activists, journalists, and then we say, well, we can't trust the United States. But here, let's listen to regime propaganda and Russia propaganda instead.
It's the Organization for the Prevention of Chemical Weapons, OPCW, that has investigators there. Interestingly, Chelsea Manning, you tweeted, so if a foreign country launched missiles at Pueblo Chemical Depot in Colorado and Bluegrass Depot in Kentucky, it'd be totally chill. Explain your comparison.
So yeah, that was in response to somebody who's tried to say that this isn't a war. This wasn't an act of war against, a foreign, in a foreign country. But it's a subjective matter. If somebody did that to us, it would obviously be, a war. So this is, and this is a war. This is an engagement, and this is an escalation, and this has been a consistent escalation. And I just want to say that this is not what happened in Syria, in the last few days has not been from the American perspective, has not been, or like Britain and France perspective, has not been about what's actually happening in Syria. It has nothing to do with Syria. It has nothing to do with the Syrian people. It has nothing to do with the Middle East. It has everything to do with domestic policy, and it has everything to do with Russia. I mean, we've heard this constant rhetorical position again and again about Russia, 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 and we're really, and the tweets indicated, the tweets that we saw last week by Donald Trump indicated that we're trying to, we're trying to provoke Russia into a proxy war, and that's a very dangerous thing to do. We're really putting ourselves closer and closer to the brink every single time that we increase the rhetoric, we increase the pressure, and whether it's sanctions or if it's bombings against like the tweet was about, the tweet we saw last week was about Russia, not about Syria. Like that just indicates how little this has to do with Syria and everything to do with Russia.
Well, British Royal Air Force jets joined American and French warplanes and ships in hitting targets in Syria Saturday in response to the reported chemical attack in Douma. Today, British Prime Minister Theresa May will face lawmakers as she attempts to justify her decision to launch the airstrikes against Syria without a vote in the British Parliament as, quote, in Britain's national interest and meant to stop more suffering from chemical weapons attacks. This comes as Jeremy Corbyn, leader of Britain's main opposition Labour Party, said it should introduce a War Powers Act to ban military action without Parliament's approval. Speaking on the BBC, Corbyn also said President Trump should speak directly with Putin.
Quite clearly, any country that's deeply involved in Syria could cause an awful lot more trouble now if they wanted to. I hope that President Trump will listen to wise counsels, listen also to wise counsels outside the USA, and pick up the phone to Putin and talk.
So that's the British Labour leader, Jeremy Corbyn. Rama Kudemi, your response.
Elsie was saying this has nothing to do, it seems like we talk about U.S. and Russia, and that's what Corbyn is also saying, is that, oh, well, the U.S. and the Russia need to talk things out. Where's the justice for the Syrian people? Where's the justice for the Syrian people who, again, were inspired by the uprisings that took place in Tunisia, in Libya, in Egypt, in Bahrain, in Iraq, in Yemen, were inspired to say, hey, we can also make a demand. We can also live without a brutal dictatorship. We want our freedom and our dignity. And then they were met with supporters of Assad who said, it is Assad or we burn the country, and they've proceeded to burn the country with the support of Iran, with the support of Russia, with friends of Syria such as the U.S. And Turkey and Saudi Arabia, who in fact were not friends, but actually also going in and looking for their national interests. And I think that is what is missing in all of these discussions about the future of Syria, is where is justice and accountability for war crimes? And Russia is an enabler of the regime. Russia has, for so long now, Russia has been, quote-unquote, leading peace processes. We've had several years. People will say, well, it's time for diplomacy. There's been diplomacy since 2012. There's been talks and negotiations in Geneva, in Sochi, in Astana, in so many different places, for years. And yet the problem is, because these demands are not around justice, these demands are not around an end, immediate end to all airstrikes, whether they are regime airstrikes, U.S. airstrikes, Russian airstrikes, and putting on the table that the Syrian people deserve accountability from the leaders who brought all these war crimes against them. And until we get to that level of discussion, there's no purpose in talking about diplomacy. There's no purpose about ceasefires if no one's actually concerned with talking about the reality of what happened in Syria. And instead, we're constantly fed, oh, it's not clear what's happening. It's too complicated. These are just, Syrians are just killing each other, and we should just stay out of it. The United States should just stay out of it. When in fact, again, the reality is the Syrian people are suffering. They've made a demand for the fall of the regime. They've requested support in getting that accountability for war, in getting justice. And frankly, they have been abandoned not only by the powers that be, and that's expected, obviously, because powers of be are not concerned with these issues. They are concerned with national interests and their own security and their own war profiteering. But they have been abandoned, most sadly, by an international left, an international anti-war movement that should have been said, yes, we support people's struggles. We support revolution. We support the idea that we want to live in freedom and dignity and bring down systems of oppression. And instead, the Syrian people have been spit on by these people and told, actually, you need to die in silence and stop bothering us.
And the issue of who is allowed to come into the United States, the ban on Syrians as the U.S. is bombing Syria, Rama?
Yeah, and again, this is where we need to push on U.S. policies that Trump likes to present himself as some hero in this case, and has been meant that this Muslim ban, which impacts obviously people from a lot of countries, but very directly the Syrian refugees who are trying to escape these various powers that are bombing the country. And yeah, it is ridiculous, and we need to be pushing in terms of thinking about demands. People say, well, there's nothing to do on Syria. There's a lot of things to do in Syria. One, obviously, pushing the United States to accept more refugees, and not only the U.S. The EU itself has also shut down its borders. Countries across the globe are shutting down their borders to various refugees, but especially Syrian refugees. So demanding open borders for all refugees, and then demanding a discourse shift that we talk about Syria based on what the Syrian people rose up and demanded, and looking at it that way and demanding, yes, an end to all airstrikes, more humanitarian aid to support people's needs for survival, and accountability for all war crimes.
Chelsea Manning, you're running for U.S. Senate against Ben Cardin. The primary is in June. What about the issue of taking the U.S. bombing of Syria to Congress to have it authorized?
Well, I think that congressional authorization is sort of this. Obviously, no single person should have the power to be able to arbitrarily engage in airstrikes just for whatever reason without any checks and balances or anything like that. So I really think that having a president or having any single person with this much power is problematic. But I also think that in this instance where you have, even if you had congressional authorization, this is not about, you don't bring humanitarian relief by sending in missiles. That's not how this works. What we need to do, and I completely agree, is we need to open the borders. I mean, we allowed 11, refugees in the last few months. 11. If this is about the humanitarian needs, then we need to start opening the borders here in the United States, here in throughout the EU, and all. We should be letting people pass through the borders because they're getting turned away in mass numbers.
Finally, Rama Kademi, I wanted to ask you about another issue. On Friday, Palestinians gathered for protest at the Israeli-Gaza border as part of the ongoing Great March of Return protests. Paramedics say at least 30 Palestinians were injured by Israeli soldiers during Friday's protests. Israeli soldiers have killed at least 34 Palestinians since the latest wave of protest against Israel's occupation began March 30th. You're also the director of grassroots organizing for the U.S. Campaign for Palestinian Rights. Can you talk about these protests and the Israeli soldiers' killings of these protesters?
Yeah, it's been inspiring seeing Palestinians, take up their right of return. We're going to be marking 70 years of ongoing Nakba, the forced expulsion of Palestinians to create the State of Israel back in 1948, expulsions that have continued in the past 70 years as Israel pushes more Palestinians off their lands and grabs their land to embolden its power over the Palestinian people. And unfortunately, obviously, should not be shocking that Israel will respond in the violent way, because Israel's violence, very presence on Palestinian land, is violence. And I think that we should note, obviously be inspired by the bravery of Palestinians and be prepared to push the United States to end its military support of Israel, the billions of dollars that we send in military aid to Israel every single year that allows Israel, emboldens Israel to do what it does, and the protection that Israel. And also should be noting in terms of if we want true freedom and liberation of Palestine, there needs to be freedom and liberation in the region as well. We cannot separate Palestine from the greater issues in the region, whether it's Syria, whether it's Yemen or Egypt or Libya. These are regions that have been attacked and bombed by various forces, and the impact of Israel's Zionist policies against the Palestinians goes beyond just Palestinians. Obviously impacts mostly Palestinians first and foremost. But for example, in Syria, the Golan Heights is still occupied by Israel. Israel has claimed, again and again, that the Syrian regime claims that it is at the forefront of resisting Israel, but in fact, their border with the quote unquote border with Israel has been the quietest borders for decades. Syrians were making fun of the regime when the revolution first started in Syria in Daraa in 2011, and he sent his tanks there to shut down, just children writing we want freedom slogans on walls of their schools, and the regime sent tanks and tortured these children and, wanted to really put down the uprising from the start. People made fun of the regime, telling him, the Golan Heights is that way. Why are you sending your military here? Go, liberate our land that you claim to be. So I think we need to really talk, as we see and are inspired by the Palestinian people. We should be inspired by all the people in the region who have rose up and really look at these struggles as very interlinked.
Rama Kademi, I want to thank you for being with us, Syrian-American activist based in Washington, D.C., member of the Syrian Solidarity Collective on the National Committee of the War Resisters League. I also want to thank Chelsea Manning, perhaps Iraq-Afghanistan war's most famous whistleblower, now running for Senate from Maryland. This is Democracy Now! Stay with us.
Weapon formed against me shall prosper. It won't work, no weapon formed against me shall prosper. It won't work, say no weapon formed against me shall prosper. It won't work, say no weapon formed against me shall prosper. It won't work, God will do what He said He would do. He will stand by His word, and He will come through. Yeah, God will do what He said He would do. He will stand by His word. He will.
No Weapon by Fred Hammond and the Radical for Christ. This is Democracy Now! I'm Amy Goodman. We end today's show here in New York, where police officers responding to a 911 call shot dead an unarmed, mentally troubled African-American man on a street corner in Brooklyn, April 5th. At the time of his death, Saheed Vassell was holding a metal pipe that police say they mistook for a gun. The NYPD says 4 officers, 3 in plain clothes, 1 uniform, fired 10 rounds at Vassell, a Jamaican immigrant. Resident Keenan Davis witnessed the shooting by officers who arrived in an unmarked car and described what he saw to New York Daily News reporter Edgar Sandoval.
He walked across the street with the thing in his hand. The cop's car was coming up the street. They take a U-turn. They came out the car. They didn't say freeze. They didn't say drop a weapon. In 2 seconds, all 4 cops started shooting. They killed him.
Was there like any exchange of words?
No words. No words exchanged. Nothing.
What went through your mind when you were seeing this?
When I saw they come up and I saw they made a U-turn, I said to my friend, oh, damn, the cops. I started to hold up my hand, trying to get their attention to let them know that, it's nothing serious. In 2 seconds, they started shooting.
The New York State Attorney General's office is now investigating the fatal shooting. A recent study found the Crown Heights neighborhood of Brooklyn, where Saheed Vassell was killed, is one of the 20 most gentrified in the country. When over 1,000 protesters gathered at the scene of his death, many longtime residents expressed concerns that 911 calls from new residents in the area have contributed to the criminalization of pre-existing low-income residents of color, especially black men. At first, the NYPD released edited surveillance video of Vassell's actions prior to his death. Then, after pressure, they released video showing the cops shooting Vassell. None of the officers who opened fire were wearing body cameras. The Vassell family is now calling for the release of all unedited video from the area leading up to and during the shooting. For more, we're joined by Saheed Vassel's parents, Lorna and Eric Vassel. We welcome you both to Democracy Now! And our condolences on the death of your son.
Thank you.
Can you explain to people what you understood happened, and where were you at the time, Eric Vassel?
I was home at the time when I hear a knocking on my door. I thought it was my son coming in, because he always come home at that time. Then I hear my other son says to me, "Dad, they just shot Saheed." I said, "Who shot him?" He said, "The police shot him," and he went away. I began to cry. I cried until I hear the door open. That was my son who entered back the door. I said, "What happened to the young man?" He said, "Dad, he died." And I stopped crying. And I just sit there in awe. After a while, I went to call my wife. I didn't get her. I waited for another time. I called her back, and I told her that Saheed met in an accident, and she said, okay, she will call me back. And I just stayed there, wondering about, you know, how my wife gonna take this tragic news to hear that her son, and who is my son, have just died.
Lorna Vassel, how old was Saheed?
Saheed is 34 years old.
And talk about what you understand happened.
I understand that Saheed was on the street playing around with his friends. He left going to the store. And when he was going to the store, I get to understand that as he entered between Montgomery and Utica Avenue, an unmarked police car just turned around. They did not ask him any question. They just started to fire all those shots at him. One of the guys said, when he ran to stop the police to say, no, he is an innocent person, he said they have already killed him. That's all I get to hear about my son.
Saheed Vassel, your son, apparently, as we've been covering this, slid into a downward spiral. After the police killed his friend, Ortanzo Marlon Bevell?
Yes.
In 2008, relatives and friends confirmed on Saturday, is that right?
Yes.
And so talk about his mental state and what the police are saying.
Saheed diagnosed a couple of years after his friend died that he had bipolar. I got help for him. He did not want to take the medication. He said the medication was doing him worse. But Saheed would do the best he could. He just normal, do everything the same way, come in and out, take his shower, eat his food, love to joke around. He would joke around in the house, and he just left. He was not a violent person. He was
well known in the community?
He was known in the community to everyone. He was such a loving person. He just loved to be funny, dance around. You go out the street, you would see Saheed. Even one day I was going to work, I saw Saheed and a police officer. On the street, I went up and said, "Officer, everything is okay?" He said, "Yes, that's a wonderful young man. I know him here, he's good, that's a good kid." And I said, "Okay, thank you." And I went to work. Saheed was not a violent person. In no way he was violent.
You went with your son, Eric Vassel, to church on a lot of mornings?
Yes, he used to accompany me to church on Saturday. You know, he didn't stay for the whole day service. He just come in the morning, and after the midday service, so I would go home. You know, I love the young man because my wife always say he looked like me. He's a wonderful young man, never give any trouble on the street, and he was loved by everyone.
Saheed was diagnosed as bipolar?
Yes, he did. Diagnosed bipolar, but diagnosed bipolar, I as a parent was turned away by the city because the city say I could not be responsible for him anymore because he was of age. So the city took him, abandoned him, then the police shot him.
I want to turn to the New York Police Chief, Terrence Monahan, answering reporters' questions about the police killing of your son, Saheed, when he was asked about him being bipolar. The 4 officers who responded to the 911 calls about his behavior were not specially trained to interact with emotionally disturbed people.
This was not an EDP call. This was not an emotionally disturbed call. This was a call of a man pointing what 911 calls and people felt was a gun at people on the street. When we encounter him, he turns with what appears to be a gun at the officers.
So during a radio interview with Brian Lehrer on WNYC, New York City Mayor Bill de Blasio was asked why he would not release the names of the police officers who killed Saheed or more video of the shooting. This is the mayor.
I believe the way we're doing it this way is right because there's both an internal investigation and an independent investigation. But we're also mindful of protecting everyone involved, and we don't want a situation where the names of the officers are out there. I don't think it's productive. Later on, when there is a follow-through on the process, that's when names come out appropriately. But the bottom line here is the transcripts have been put out of 911 calls. The video has been put out. All video that we have and that we continue to get will be put out once the Attorney General signs off on its release. And that's been the case previously with body camera footage in situations like this as well. And there's going to be a full process here to find out the truth. I spoke to Mr. Vassell, the father of Saheed, and he said to me the one thing he hopes will happen at the end of this process is that the truth comes out and justice is served, whatever that is. And I said I am absolutely committed to that, and I know the Attorney General is as well.
So that was New York Mayor Bill de Blasio saying the video of police shooting Saheed was withheld because the New York Attorney General's office prevented its release during its investigation. But a press secretary for the New York Attorney General, Eric Schneiderman, said in a statement, "Our office played no role in the NYPD's decision to release partial footage concerning the Vassell case last week, and we have not objected to the NYPD's release of video footage of the officers." Eric Vassell, if you can respond, you spoke to the mayor?
Yes, I spoke to the mayor. I told the mayor that I need justice to be served. But what the mayor is saying, that they won't release, any video of the officers. I see that that's a double standard, because if the video and pictures of my son can be released and sent all across the world, therefore, just like how they released my son pictures and video across the world, they should release every video and action of the police, because in the further statement they say that he pointed the thing of them. I would always say a picture word, 1,000 word. So if he did have an object in his hand, they should show him pointing that object at the police. That's the picture I am looking for.
They've only shown him in this menacing position holding this bar, but there's obviously clearly commercial area. There's lots of video that you could see. This is somewhat reminiscent of Tamir Rice, where within seconds of them arriving, they shot him.
They shot him. And I'm saying, if as a police officer, if it's a 911 call that comes in, what are the protocols that the police took to apprehend someone with a gun, someone who was mentally challenged? Because I know if they say that there's a hostages crisis somewhere, there are protocols. If they say there's a man on Brooklyn Bridge who wanted to commit suicide, there's a protocol to approach it. If they say that there's a mental person with a gun or that person have a gun, there have to be some protocol.
And of course, he didn't have a gun. He held a metal bar that looked like a shower head.
That's what they say. That's what they say. He have something in his hand that looked like a shower head. That's what they say.
We have to leave it here, but we will continue to investigate this case. Lorna and Eric Vassell have lost their son, killed by New York police earlier this month. I'm Amy Goodman. Thanks for joining us.